the last paragraph on page 42. The work is never limited to the painted, sculpted or narrated object. Just as one perceives things only against the background of the world, so the objects represented by art appear against the background of the universe. On the background of the adventures of Fabrice are the Italy of 1820, Austria, France, the sky and stars, who is the Abbe Blanis consuls, and finally the whole earth. So here Sartre is referring to Stendhal's book, The Charterhouse of Parma. Perhaps I can write it on the blackboard. Sartre is referring to Stendhal. Stendhal's novel The Charter of Parma. Now because I am writing with the mouse, that is why my handwriting is so bad. I am writing with the mouse. In French, Les Chartreux de la Palme. Those who know French, in French it is called Les Chartreux de la Palme. And interestingly, he says that one perceives things against the background of the universe, so the objects represented by art appear against the background of the universe. Now, he writes that the adventures of Fabrice in Italy, Austria, France in 1820, they are the backgrounds where the universe appears, and finally the whole earth. So, the human activity is as much the background as the world or the universe may be considered to be the background. If the painter presents us with a field or a vase of flowers, his paintings are windows which are open on the whole world. We follow the red path which is buried among the wheat much farther than Van Gogh has painted it, among other wheat fields, under other clouds, to the river which empties into the sea, and we extend to infinity, to the other end of the world, the deep finality which supports the existence of the field and the earth. So what is Sartre saying here? That when one looks at Van Gogh's painting of a red path, then one follows it beyond the painting and goes to the other end of the world, up to the infinity, follows the river, the clouds. So even things which are not painted by Van Gogh in that painting, the observer by his imagination can follow it up to the infinity. Therefore, if I write here that Sartre believes that art opens the door to infinity. How can it be philosophically explained or supported? The work of art, therefore, is not bound by its frames as far as it is perceived by the observer. The observer's imagination can take him far, and there is no limit to an observer's imagination. Therefore, this theory of aesthesis, aesthetic theory, which is derived from the Greek word aesthesis, which means perception. It is therefore dependent upon the theory that we perceive the world through our consciousness, and similarly we perceive a work of art also through our consciousness. Therefore, this theory is dependent upon Husserl's theory of phenomenology. In which consciousness has a very great role to play. Okay. So now I'm really writing very badly today. Yesterday my handwriting was a little better. Whatever. So what is important here is the idea that we extend to infinity. The perception of art leads us to some kind of perception of infinity. So that through the various objects which it produces or reproduces, the creative act aims at a total renewal of the world. This is an important message by Sartre in this essay, that the goal of art. Now you know that in this essay Sartre is not writing from a teleological point of view. That is, that art should have an end or goal. But even then, he speaks of a kind of goal of art which is renewal of the world. Renewal of the world. Now, do we charge Sartre for being contradictory here? That even though he does not represent a teleological theory of art, yet he speaks of the goal of art, renewal of the world. We may say, first of all, that renewal of the world cannot be conceived as a concrete goal. It is not something concrete, something useful. So it is not a goal thought in terms of its use value, utilitarian value. No. So renewal of the world is nothing but a perception, because as according to existential philosophy, the consciousness tries to appropriate the world into itself. So when my consciousness works upon the world, it renews the world. That is, I conquer the world, I appropriate the world as far as my consciousness is possible, is capable of doing. Therefore, in that sense, it is a renewal of the world. So, it is not a renewal of the world in the universal sense, that I appropriate the world by my consciousness, which everybody else can also see. No. So for every individual consciousness there will be an individual world, and every individual will renew the world through art by means of the working of his consciousness. Therefore, this goal of art is only a phrase, it is not teleological at all. It is not teleological in the sense of universal application or utilitarian value. Right. So Sartre is not contradicting himself. So Van Gogh's art leads to totality of being. Now we come to another phrase. So that through the various objects which it produces or reproduces, the creative act aims at a total renewal of the world. Each painting, each book is a recovery of the totality of being. Each of them presents this totality to the freedom of the spectator. So here we encounter another phrase, totality of being. Now you may wonder that the phrase is already in your book and you can see the phrase and also hear when I am speaking it. So why should I so painstakingly write it on the board? Now why I write it on the board is as much for you as for myself, because by writing it I focus on it. I can focus on it.
So we can't see the board.
You can't see the board. So totality of being is a phrase which you easily realize is from the philosophy of existentialism, because it speaks about being with a capital B, which means not individual being but universal being, being in the sense of universal being, being with a capital B. And we also get the concept of totality and infinity, which I already told you that Levinas has a book called Totality and Infinity. Now, totality supposes that we are not in our consciousness, we are not limited to our particular individuality or our self and our selfishness. So when we think of totality, if we can perceive totality at all, then I am extending my consciousness to include everything else, include others. So the cruel contradiction or competition or hostility between self and other, which is the reason for much of our misery, because we cannot think of others as self. We think of others as others, and we can realize only our own private individual self, whereas existentialist philosophy demands that everybody should try to extend his self onto the other and appropriate others in his self, so that ultimately one has the realization that there is nothing beyond self. So everybody is included in that self. When we can appropriate that totality, then we are relieved of the cruel, selfish, conduct of the self, and we can extend ourselves into a totality, and we can include others into that totality as well. And Sartre says that art is a catalyst that helps us to renew this totality of being. Therefore, philosophically, art helps us in the appropriation of the world into our consciousness. And when we include others into our totality of being, then we are also exercising our freedom. Because as I told you, I remind you that according to existential philosophy, freedom is the gap between self and other, and what will be my attitude towards other, that will determine whether I would be able to include others into my totality, or the other will always remain outside my being. So art helps us to exercise this freedom to include others into this totality. For this is quite the final goal of art, to recover the world by giving it to be seen as it is, but as if it had its source in human freedom. Now this sentence, you see, is charged with the philosophical understanding of the finality of art, which is finalité sans fin, according to Sartre, finality without end. So what is the finality without end? Why without end? Because it is non-teleological. That is, we do not appropriate the world in order to derive some benefit for ourselves, some selfish benefit for ourselves. If we do that, then it will be finality with an end. That is, well, I accept you as my friend. I am simplifying things, like philosophical concepts are not simple in this manner. I accept you as my friend, or I accept you in my close circle with some ulterior end in mind. That is, if I accept you as friend, then you perhaps will help me in writing an answer, or you will explain something to me which I do not understand. So this kind of friendship, you realize that it is not selfless. So it is selfish friendship. Therefore, end always means some kind of selfish objective, where you have a utilitarian end or goal in mind. But the expression purposiveness without purpose in Kant, which Sartre translates as finalité sans fin, that is finality without end. So that means art helps us in recovering the world, where we arrive at a finality, but without any teleological end in view, or without any such purpose in view. To recover this world by giving it to be seen as it is. So the world is as it is, that is, the world as fact, the world as given. Now what does Kant think about this? Kant thinks that the world is already there as a fact. We direct our consciousness to it, and then we see it, we appropriate it. But existential philosophy does not believe in this. So Sartre differs with Kant by saying that no, the world, actually not Sartre, it is Husserl, no, not the world is not there as a fact. The world becomes a fact for me only when I look at it. It is only when I focus my consciousness on it. So by looking at it, by focusing my consciousness on it, I recover this world for myself to be seen as it is, but as if it had its source in human freedom. So this world would not have become for me a fact unless I exercise my freedom. Therefore it appears that the world is as if it is produced by my freedom. But since what the author creates takes on objective reality only in the eyes of the spectator, this recovery is consecrated by the ceremony of the spectacle. A beautiful phrase. ceremony of the spectacle, that is, unless the spectator looks at the work, the author cannot make the work an object, as I told you earlier, that the author cannot objectively look at his work, because he has produced the work and his subjectivity is so much into the work that he does not have the distance from which to look at the work as an object. Therefore, the author is solely dependent upon the spectator, and the spectator looking at the work is a ceremony of spectacle. A beautiful phrase. So imagine I am picking up a book from my shelf and I open it and I look at it. Sartre would call it a ceremony. So next time when you pick up a book for reading, do it in a ceremonious fashion. That is the ceremony of spectacle. Why it is so important? Because it is an act by which a consciousness works upon the world or works upon a work of art. Therefore, it is a ceremony of what? Of spectacle, because I am looking at it. But since this recovery is consecrated by the ceremony of the spectacle and particularly of reading, we are already in a better position to answer the question we raised a while ago. The writer chooses to appeal to the freedom of other men, so that by the reciprocal implications of their demands, they may readapt the totality of being to man and may again enclose the universe within man. Alright, so first half of the sentence you already understand. Reciprocal, that is writer and reader, they together work on the work of art. The reader, by reading the book, appropriates the totality of beings. But the last half, so that by readapting the totality of being to man, may again enclose the universe within man. So the world, if we imagine the world to be the totality, if the universe is the totality, as long as I do not appropriate the totality, the universe is not inside man. The universe is outside his consciousness. So if the universe is outside his consciousness, then it is not there in his world, in his psyche. Therefore, the reader, by reading a book, encloses the universe within man. And then Sartre goes on to speak about aesthetic pleasure. So gradually he is coming to the theory of the aesthetic theory of work producing pleasure. But this pleasure is very different from the traditional idea of art that provides entertainment or provides pleasure. You remember the Horatian tag of art as utile et dulce in Ars Poetica. So utile, useful, dulce, sweetness or pleasure. So first of all, Sartre has already contradicted the first part of this theory, that art may be useful. Okay. And what remains is dulce or sweetness or pleasure. But the way Sartre defines this pleasure is very different from the conventional idea of entertainment. We must bear in mind that the writer, like all other artists, aims at giving his reader a certain feeling that is customarily called aesthetic pleasure, and which I would very much rather call aesthetic joy, and that this feeling, when it appears, is a sign that the work is achieved. It is therefore fitting to examine it in the light of the preceding considerations. This joy which is denied to the creator insofar as he creates becomes one with the aesthetic consciousness of the spectator, that is in the case under consideration of the reader. It is a complex feeling, but one whose structure and condition are inseparable from one another. So, the feeling of the reader or the spectator is an aesthetic experience or aesthetic pleasure, which Sartre calls aesthetic joy. And this aesthetic joy can be perceived only by the spectator or the reader, not by the artist, not by the creator. It is identical with the recognition of a transcendent and absolute end, which for a moment suspends the utilitarian round of ends means and means ends. Therefore, this aesthetic joy or aesthetic pleasure, according to Sartre, is transcendence of any kind of utilitarian or end means end also refers to teleology, transcendence of teleological goals. Therefore, you see that according to Sartre's theory, enjoying a work of art, either reading a book or looking at a painting, it does not have any purpose. It is not a utilitarian goal, and it is therefore realization which transcends all end means mean ends equations or purposes, and therefore Sartre says that this is also a recognition of freedom, that you are exercising your freedom by reading something or by looking at something, looking at a work of art. And this freedom, recognition of freedom creates joy, because you become aware of your non-theatical consciousness. The joy is a result or is a product when you are aware of your non-theatical consciousness. Alright, so what is non-theatical? Non-dogmatic. Non-theatical means non-dogmatic. So how does that give you immense joy? You do not believe in any dogma, any orthodox teaching, and therefore you are free. but it is well, you can see that it is not acceptable to any religious or otherwise ideological position. So, but it is the existentialist position that when you are free of any ideology, then you feel joy, the joy of the recognition of your freedom, that your consciousness is non-dogmatic, non-thetical. Thetical from thesis. Thesis means dogma, some kind of opinion. That is thesis. Well, since in effect reading is creation, my freedom does not only appear to itself as pure anatomy, but as creative activity. That is, it is not limited to giving itself its own law, but perceives itself as being constitutive of the object. It is on this level that the phenomenon specifically is manifested, that is, a creation wherein the created object is given as object to its creator. So now Sartre is talking about the artist or the creator. Well, so first of all, he has already established that the reader is also a creator, and therefore he exercises his freedom in reading, and reading is also partial creating, and this act of creation leads to the created object being given as object to its creator. Now, here by the word creator, Sartre is referring to the reader. So to the reader, when the created object, the work of art, when the work of art is appropriated in the reader's consciousness, then it appears as an object to the reader. It appears as an object. Alright. So for this dialectic of subject and object, if you remember, there is a need of some distance from which the subject can appropriate an object or look at a thing as an object. And the writer himself finds it difficult because he does not have this distance. But when the reader looks at it, then in his consciousness it is appropriated as an object, and therefore the dialectic of subjectivity and objectivity comes full circle, and then the act of creation finds fulfillment as it has been appropriated by a reader or by another consciousness, and that leads to also the writer's recognition of freedom. It is an exceptional joy, and the word enjoyment which is applied to the positional consciousness of the work of the work read indicates sufficiently that we are in the presence of an essential structure of the aesthetic joy. So such idea of aesthetic joy is squarely grounded or founded upon the structure of the dialectic of subject and object. So unless the work appears as an object to the subjective consciousness of the reader, the aesthetic joy cannot be produced. Okay, so the aesthetic joy is produced by means of the dialectical appropriation and appreciation of a work of art as an object by the subjectivity of the reader. But the reader's consciousness of the work of art as an object, Sartre calls it a positional consciousness. So if we think of a consciousness which posits something, that is, the consciousness of the reader posits the object, posits the work of art as an object. Therefore, it is a positional consciousness.
Sir, I did not understand this positional consciousness.
I will explain. Right. So, insofar as the consciousness of the reader posits the work of art as an object to itself, to its subjectivity, it is a positional consciousness. So consciousness may be positional or non-positional. He explains it in the next line. This positional enjoyment is accompanied by the non-positional consciousness of being essential in relation to an object perceived as essential. So when the reader can feel himself as essential, because without the reader's consciousness, the work of art does not appear as an object. Therefore, the reader enjoys the work of art since it appears as an object to him. Aesthetic joy is produced, and then he can be aware of his essential nature. That is, without his consciousness, this would not have been possible. And this understanding of the essential relation to art is the act of a different consciousness or a higher consciousness, okay, and that is the non-positional consciousness. because this consciousness which appreciates or which can realize the essential relation of the subject to the object, it works at a higher level. So at the lower level, the consciousness looks at a work of art, posits it as an object, and an aesthetic joy is produced. He enjoys the experience of this phenomenon. So this is a phenomenon. Okay? The phenomenon of the work appearing as an object to the subjective consciousness of the reader. That is the phenomenon. So that is the function of a lower level. I mean, I am using the lower and higher. I may not, perhaps I should not use, because Sartre does not use any lower or higher. So let us say only two different levels of consciousness. So one level of consciousness realizes the work of art as an object. It is a positional consciousness because it posits the work of art as an object. Another level of consciousness understands the essential relationship of the subject to the work of art. So this understanding of this essential relation, that is the function of the non-positional consciousness, because this consciousness does not posit anything. So this consciousness is non-positional. I shall call this aspect of the aesthetic consciousness the feeling of security. It is this which stamps the strongest aesthetic emotions with a sovereign calm. It has its origin in the authentication of a strict harmony between subjectivity and objectivity. So, when the reader can perceive how the object of or the work of art is there for appropriation by his consciousness, then he realizes his essentiality or his essential relation apropos the work of art by his non-positional consciousness, and that gives him a sense of security, a sense of calm, and so on and so forth, according to Sartre. So we may say that this sense of security, calm, these are concomitant with aesthetic joy. So aesthetic joy, as on the other hand, the aesthetic object is properly the world insofar as it is aimed at through the imaginary. Aesthetic joy accompanies the positional consciousness that the world is a value, that is a task proposed to human freedom. So very cleverly Sartre moves on from talking about the joy of looking at a work of art as an object, or the appropriation of work of art as an object, to the appropriation of the world as an object. Thus, the act of aesthetic enjoyment is a paradigm similar to the act of enjoying the world. Okay. So let us imagine you have this situation where the reader's consciousness appropriates the work of art as an object, and by another level of consciousness, non-positional consciousness, the reader is also able to understand his essential relation to art, and that provides him with aesthetic joy. So let us take this as a model, a paradigm, and let us extend this onto the world. Sartre says that similarly, by extension, the world may be perceived as an object by the reader's consciousness. Because that is the proper aim of any consciousness. What is the proper aim of any consciousness? Again we go back to Husserl. The proper aim of any consciousness is to appropriate the entire world, to appropriate the totality, the infinity within this consciousness. So, when the reader appropriates the world as an object, or when anybody, any consciousness appropriates the world as an object, as it is aimed through the imaginary, aesthetic joy accompanies the positional consciousness that the world is a value. Then aesthetic joy develops because of this positional consciousness, that is, I posited the world as an object to my consciousness. Out of that I derive an aesthetic joy that the world is a value. And here, very silently in Sartre's discourse, creeps in the idea of morality, because what is value? Value is some kind of morality. And if you remember Kant's categorical imperative, so it is imperative to appropriate the value of the world. So Sartre is substituting the work of art with the world. So as appropriating the work of art as a value produces aesthetic joy, similarly appropriating the world as a value also produces aesthetic joy. And that is a task proposed to human freedom. So you perhaps remember that earlier in the essay Sartre says that the world is my task. So before us, as for a reader, it is his task to pick up a book and read it. Similarly, the world is there lying for our consciousness to appropriate it, and therefore I can appropriate it by exercising my freedom. So that is my task. And then, as I have been telling you from time to time, that our consciousness cannot appreciate anything as an object unless there is a distance between myself and the object. Here, Sartre introduces the idea of distance. I shall call this aesthetic modification of the human project, for as usual, the world appears as the horizon of our situation, as the infinite distance which separates us from ourselves, as the synthetic totality of the given, as the undifferentiated whole of obstacles and implements, but never as a demand addressed to our freedom. So the world is a given, but it is the infinite distance. It is at an infinite distance. So man is situated, what did I say earlier, in a situation. Now this is tautological, but if I say man is situated in the world, that is making the world a priori appear as an object which existentialism does not believe in. The world is not a priori an object. The world has to be appropriated as an object by the consciousness. Therefore, I cannot say that man is situated in the world. I have to say that man is in a situation, and in this situation the world is there waiting for being appropriated by the consciousness, and while appropriating this world, our consciousness becomes aware of the infinite distance. Infinite distance. Now, remember that the writer cannot understand the work of art as an object because there is no distance between himself and the work of art. So, in order to appreciate or appropriate the world into our consciousness, we must be aware of the infinite distance between the world and ourselves. Self to the world. Let us imagine that it is an infinite distance. So I brought the world as far as possible from the word self to symbolically represent the infinite distance. But then you may say, what if we do not talk only about the distance? Let us imagine that it is not just the distance, but it is also a sense of the infinite that we perceive when we perceive the world. So then I will be leading you into a quagmire of phenomenology. But that might also lead you to the theory of the sublime, because the sublime is an experience of the infinite, but Sartre is not charting that path. That is the path of the romantic critics. The world is my task, that is the essential and freely accepted function of my freedom is to make that unique and absolute object which is the universe come into being in an unconditioned movement. So the world is a unique and absolute object of my for my perception. Why is the world lying there outside our consciousness? Absolutely for our consciousness to perceive it. That is why it is an absolute object. And while we perceive it, we exercise our freedom to perceive, to appropriate this world. And thirdly, the preceding structures imply a pact between him and freedoms. For on the one hand, reading is a confident and exacting recognition of the freedom of the writer, and on the other hand, aesthetic pleasure, as it is itself experienced in the form of a value, involves an absolute exigence in regard to others. Here we have a very important word, important for existential philosophy. Exigence. Why is it an exigence? The experience of the world or the work of art. Why is it an exigence? Because whether I will direct my consciousness onto it or not, that is my choice, that is my freedom. So as I gave you the example earlier, there are so many books on my bookshelf. Whether I will pick up one of them and start reading or not, that is absolutely, a chance event, an exigence. It is not determined by anything, because I have the sole freedom to pick up or not to pick up. Therefore, whether the world will be appropriated by my consciousness or not, that is an act of exigence. If you feel tired or if you want a 5 minutes break, you can tell me. Do you want any break? Every man, insofar as he is a freedom, feels the same pleasure in reading the same work. Is there anything unusual in this sentence? Every man, insofar as he is a freedom. You may imagine that this is a literal translation of the French of Sartre, because in English, obviously, it is not normal construction to say that a man is a freedom. Therefore, it can be said only with a specific meaning. What is the meaning? That a man is nothing but a consciousness. A man is looked upon here as a consciousness, and a consciousness in this scenario of phenomenology or phenomenological appropriation of the world. Man exercises his freedom, therefore man is nothing but a freedom in this frame. And he feels the same pleasure in reading the same work. Thus all mankind is present in its highest freedom. It sustains the being of a world which is both its world and the external world. Very interesting. The world that you perceive with your senses, is it only in your consciousness, or is it also lying there as an external fact? According to existentialism, it is both. So, unless it is there as an existence, your consciousness cannot work on it and perceive its essence. So according to existential philosophy, existence precedes essence. Existence is prior to essence. And only then your consciousness can work on it and appropriate its essence. Therefore, insofar existence is there outside, it is external. insofar your consciousness perceives it, it is the essence of the world that you perceive, so it is your world. Or as here Sartre writes, its world. That is the world of this particular consciousness, and this is the external world. Now here there is a great difference between existential philosophy and materialistic philosophy. So existential philosophy of Husserl and Heidegger opposes materialistic philosophy. But as you know that Sartre was in between. Sartre had great fascination for Marxism, which is a materialistic philosophy, but phenomenology and Heidegger's philosophy, they are not materialistic. So, according to materialistic philosophy, the material world, which is not acted upon by consciousness, this material world is true. And this is where existentialism differs. Because if you say that the material world is true, what actually you are saying is that the world we perceive is true. So according to Marxism, which is a materialistic philosophy, not Marxism, I mean according to materialistic philosophy, the world as we perceive it with our senses, that world is true. So actually this materialistic world talks about the essence. Only existentialism can imagine the external world as existence on which one's consciousness works. Okay. Therefore, for existentialism, it is possible to use the same dialectic of materialism, but conceive of a world that is there to be acted upon by the consciousness. In aesthetic joy, the positional consciousness is an image-making consciousness of the world in its totality, both as being and having to be, both as totally ours and totally foreign, and the more ours as it is the more foreign. Sartre is talking about the production of aesthetic joy when our consciousness works upon the world. The world is foreign to my consciousness, but it becomes mine when my consciousness works on it, and the function of my consciousness is image making. So, when Husserl talks about consciousness working upon the living world, then he is thinking about the image of the world that is made by the consciousness. And therefore, this Husserlian phenomenology has an application in the appropriation or appreciation of works of art. So an aesthetic theory can be derived from this phenomenological philosophy which speaks about image-making consciousness, because that is the principal function of the artist also, to make images. The artist also makes images, the reader also makes images when he is reading. So both the creation of the work of art and the appreciation of the work of art, both are image-making processes. So, therefore here we see a dialectic between consciousness and the world. Or we may say self and the world. Dialectical process. So there is a dialectical relationship between consciousness and the world. The non-positional consciousness really envelops the harmonious totality of human freedoms insofar as it makes the object of a universal confidence and exigency. What is the function of the non-positional consciousness? To appreciate and enjoy the essential relation to art. Therefore, the non-positional consciousness envelops the totality of human freedom insofar as it makes the object of universal confidence. In other words, the world is appropriated by the consciousness, which is an act of exigence and application of one's freedom. Freedom would necessarily mean exigence, because if you are free, then you may apply your consciousness to something or you may not apply. So it is a chance. So Sartre has repeated this a great number of times so that we have no doubt about it, that the appropriation of the world or the appreciation of the work of art, they are always a phenomenon. They are phenomena where there is this exigence or the freedom of the consciousness being applied to this world, and by applying the consciousness, the harmonious totality of the world is perceived. Is this clear?
Yes, sir.
To write is thus both to disclose the world and to offer it as a task to the generosity of the reader. So now that Sartre has used the task so many times, the word task, so now we should understand why the world is a task to my consciousness, or why reading a book is a task for the reader. Now, can you tell me why is it a task? The word task always makes you think of something which is imposed on you. Like a home task, something that you do not want to do, but it is imposed on you. But Shastra is not using the word task in that sense. He is using the word task in the sense that there is something to be done, or there is the potentiality of something which can be acted upon. In that sense, it is a task. So
Yes, sir. Because the only way that the world can be or the universe can be appropriated as he said that the world becomes a fact uh, when I bring that universe into me. So
exactly. So the universe is lying there. Dasein, as Heidegger says, it is there. The being that is there. Therefore, our consciousness has the task of working on it and to disclose it. And particularly the writer discloses the world, or the painter, the artist, as when earlier Sartre was discussing Van Gogh's painting or Vermeer's painting, he said that the painter discloses a certain relationship, a number of relationships in his work of art, which when appreciated by the spectator, then they are fulfilled, or they are properly perceived. The work of art is perceived as an object. So the work of art, according to Sartre, has a function of revealing something, disclosing something. So the writer's or the creator's consciousness, what does it disclose? It discloses the world, but in his own way, according to the design of his consciousness. To write is thus both to disclose the world and to offer it as a task to the generosity of the reader. Why generosity? Because the reader is free. So the reader would exercise his freedom whether to collaborate with the writer or not by reading his book. Therefore, this notion of generosity. Now, the notion of generosity, I suppose, also has an ethical implication, because by being generous, by deciding to read an author's book, you are doing what ethically you should do. That is, you should read that book. Somebody has taken the trouble of writing it. Therefore, ethically you should not neglect it, you should read it. So, insofar as we are talking about the writer and reader relationship, we see that there is an ethics in that relationship. But if we extend this idea of generosity to the world, then whenever we are in a relationship with the others, then we are in an ethical relationship. That is, how do we treat others? What should be our attitude towards others? So, that is the domain of ethics on which Levinas has written, but in this text, Sartre does not dwell upon ethics very clearly, very elaborately, but it is an underlying notion here, this idea of generosity. It is to wish to live this essentiality, that is, It is to have recourse to the consciousness of others in order to make oneself to be recognized as essential to the totality of being. It is to wish to live this essentiality by means of interposed persons, but on the other hand, as the real world is revealed only by action, as one can feel oneself in it, only by exceeding it in order to change it, the novelist universe would lack depth if it were not discovered in a movement to transcend it. A very clever movement of thought. Sartre says that the real world is revealed by action, and one has to, one can feel oneself in it by exceeding in order to change it. Now, where did he get this idea of change? I suppose from Marx, because Marx said that philosophers have only interpreted the world. The real purpose is to change the world. Therefore, there is an underlying concept of revolution, an underlying concept of change. So as we reveal the world by our action, by exceeding it in order to change it, in the novelist universe, similarly, it would lack depth if it were not discovered in a movement to transcend it. So as in this world, we have to exceed the world in order to change it. Similarly, when reading a novel, when reading a work of, a book, a work of art, we must transcend that work of art. We must go beyond it. It has often been observed that an object in a story does not derive its density of existence from the number and length of the descriptions devoted to it, but from the complexity of its connections with the different characters. Of course, the density of existence. Now, the density of existence in a work of art is understood by looking at the characters in the novel and the way things are described at length. So, but not from the number of pages ascribed to it in describing something, or from the length of the description, that the density can be understood or be what over. But from the complexity of its connections with the different characters. The more often the characters handle it, take it up and put it down, in short, go beyond it towards their own ends, the more real will it appears. What is Sartre talking about? Density of the book? No. Density of existence. So as the world outside lying there for our consciousness to realize it, to appropriate it, similarly the fictitious world of the book tries to represent an existence, a dense existence, and the density of the existence mimicked or represented in the book does not depend upon number of pages or length. It can be a very brief, book, a novel of a very short length, as most modern novels are. Yet they are extremely dense, or they present a dense existence. And how can they present a dense existence in a very brief span? By revealing a complex connection among everything in this existence. The characters handle it, take it up, put it down. What do they handle, take up and put down? Existence. The object here is existence. So the characters in the novel take up existence, handle it, put it down. In short, go beyond it towards their own ends. So the characters they have their own selfish ends, maybe relationship, the desire of fulfilling a love relationship or something or other. Just like in life we have our selfish ends, but when we try to appropriate the world, then we extend ourselves beyond our selfish end. We include others in our universe. Similarly, in the existence depicted in a novel, the characters have their own selfish ends, but they sometimes go beyond those ends to appropriate that complex connection which is existence in that novel. The more they go beyond it toward their own ends, the more real will it appear. Thus, of the word of the novel, that it is the totality of men and things, we may say that in order for it to offer its maximum density, the disclosure creation by which the reader discovers it must also be an imaginary participation in the action. So, the more the characters are involved in the action of that fictitious existence in the novel, the more real it appears, and the reader discovers the density of the book by looking at the disclosure creation principle in the book. So can you see the parallelism, how Sartre is applying the phenomenological interpretation of how our consciousness works on the world? He is applying that with reference to literary criticism or the reader reading a novel. So as in the world there is, by our consciousness we discover the world and we appropriate it as real. Similarly, in the book there is this fictitious existence which is also there to be discovered by the disclosure creation principle. In other words, the more disposed one is to change it, the more alive it will be. Just as in our world, if we want to change the world, if we want to, exercise our freedom to remove all oppression by bringing about revolution, then we look more alive. Similarly, in a novel, if the characters have an attitude of changing the world, then they would look more real, more alive. The error of realism has been to believe that the real reveals itself to contemplation, and that consequently one could draw an impartial picture of it. How could that be possible, since the very perception is partial, since by itself the naming is already a modification of the object? And how could the writer, who wants himself to be essential to this universe, want to be essential to the injustice which this universe comprehends? So Sartre says that the bourgeois idea of realism, obviously he has in his mind the bourgeois novels in the French tradition, Balzac, Stendhal, the great realist novelists, and later Flaubert. So the realism in these, the idea of realism or the philosophical thought behind realism in art was that by meditation one can understand the reality of the world, the reality. It is an object to contemplation, and through meditation one can draw an impartial picture of the reality. And now, obviously, Sartre doesn't believe in this notion of aesthetic realism because contemplation will not yield an impartial picture, because the picture is always partial according to existential philosophy. How can one have an impartial picture? This is an invention of bourgeois idealism, of idealist philosophy, that by contemplation you will have an impartial picture of things. You will have a real appreciation of things. But everything is partial because according to existentialism, it is the consciousness of the reader or the consciousness of the individual which works on this world. So consciousness of the reader works on the novel and tries to appreciate the novel. And everything is modified, everything is changed by one's consciousness. So I name something, the moment I name a thing, it is modified by my consciousness. It is already partial. Therefore, the writer who wants himself to be essential to the universe, how can he want to be essential to the injustice which this universe comprehends? So the world is unjust. The writer who wants to feel essential to the world, will he corroborate the injustice of the world in his work? Because if he corroborates an unjust world in his work, in his novel, then he has his consciousness could not apprehend his essential relationship to the world. What is his essential relationship to the world? That his consciousness is free. Therefore, a free consciousness can never want to depict a world which is not free, which is unjust, because that will not reveal the essence of his relationship to the world, that he is free. Yet he must be, but if he accepts being the creator of injustices, it is in a movement which goes beyond them towards their abolition. So here Sartre is talking about the realistic tradition in novels. So since the world is unjust, so a writer, if he follows realism, he must depict the injustice of the world in his work. But that goes against his, status as a free writer, one who is free in his essential relationship to the world. But he accepts it in a movement that goes beyond them towards their abolition. In other words, even though a writer might realistically depict an unjust world, the impact of the novel or the tendency of the novel would lead the reader away from the injustice towards the abolition of injustice.
So can you repeat this portion once?
Yes, of course.
I just got very confused.
So, Shastra here is talking about the realistic technique in novels, the artistic tradition of realism. So, according to this tradition, the novelist must depict the world realistically. Now, the world is unjust. Therefore, the novelist also must depict an unjust world in his work. But that goes against the principle of, against the principle that a writer is essentially free. And if he cannot realize his, freedom, if he cannot realize that he is essentially free in relationship to the world and in relationship to the work of art, if he cannot realize this freedom, then he cannot produce a work of art that is that can be offered to the reader as an object. So, when the writer follows realism, he is compelled to reproduce or to depict an unjust world. But even then, he writes in such a fashion that the reader, while reading it, would transcend the work, go beyond the work, and the work would lead him beyond the world depicted in the work, that is the unjust world depicted in the work, and would point towards justice and freedom. Okay, Shastra will give further examples. As for me who read, if I create and keep alive an unjust world, I cannot help making myself responsible for it. And the author's whole art is bent on obliging me to create what he discloses, therefore to compromise myself. As a reader, Shastra says, if I read a work and the work tells me that yes, this unjust world, this unjust world is the true disclosure of reality, then I compromise myself. Why I compromise myself? Because I read a book in order to exercise my freedom. I do not read a book to believe that I am a slave, or to believe that the world is a system of slavery. We are all slaves. We do not read books or look at works of art in order to feel that we are slaves, or that we have no freedom, or that we are unjust. That is, the world is unjust. We do not try to change it, so we comply with it, and indirectly we support this unjust world. I do not read a book with such a view in mind. Alright. Therefore, if the novelist makes me feel that the world is unjust and that is what it should be, then he is making me compromise with the principle of my freedom. So here is a subtle distance between the unjust world depicted by the writer and the writer also convincing the reader that that is how the world should be. So what Sartre is suggesting is that a writer may depict an unjust world because that is the reality outside. That is the reality that we see, that the world is unjust. But a writer should by no means convince the reader that that is how it should be. That is, the writer should keep certain doors open through which the reader can go and transcend this unjust world depicted in the work. Now you have so far been told by Sartre here that the reader always goes beyond the work. He always transcends it. And the writer should also help him transcend it by not making his work narrow, closed, bound work enmeshed in its own selfish interest. So the work should not be written in such a manner that the reader is not encouraged to transcend it. Is it clear?
Yes, sir. I was just wondering if Sartre is trying to bring in the argument of the social responsibility that artists have.
Yes, of course, because this whole piece is about commitment in literature. So that he has explained in great detail in the first chapter of the book, What is Literature? We are reading the second chapter. So you read the first chapter, there you will see that Sartre has first created this presupposition, this context, that a writer is a committed writer. He has also said that those who write in prose, they directly involve in engaged literature or committed literature, because prose helps communication and so on and so forth. Poetry has a different function. Of course, this particular aspect of Sartre's argument was much criticized, particularly by Merleau-Ponty, and in his later career, Sartre changed his position that only prose can communicate. He also changed his position about poetry. So here, in this book, in chapter 1, he says that only prose can be committed literature, and he excludes all other forms of art, music, painting, all other forms of art from being committed or being engaged, because he believes that only words can signify, only words are signs, and therefore true communication is possible only through words, not through music, painting, or some other things, some other form of art. What happens in those forms of art? Sartre says that in those forms of art there is some kind of communication, but it is of very low frequency, so that the audience or the spectator, he can hardly grasp it, what the message is being said there. Now, of course, many of these ideas later changed, and Sartre accepted much of Merleau-Ponty's criticism. So, towards the end of my discussion of this book, I will discuss one article which talks about the engagement between Merleau-Ponty and Sartre. So Merleau-Ponty, died much earlier than Sartre, and Sartre continued to grow older and older, but in his old age he had accepted all of Merleau-Ponty's criticisms and changed himself. Alright, so I will refer to those also later once we finish this text. But in order to make this idea clear, this idea about committed literature, engagement, social responsibility, you read the first chapter, What is Literature? Thoroughly. You read the whole chapter. Do not worry whether it is in your syllabus or not. Okay. So read the whole chapter. I am not telling you to read the next two chapters. But at least read the first chapter. Otherwise, you miss the premise on which the second chapter is based. Why right? And the third and fourth chapters, they speak about the time when Sartre was writing this book. So when he is raising these questions, why right, he is raising them in the context of 1947. So the fourth chapter is situation of the writer in 1947. Therefore, by thoroughly grounding his whole argument, the argument of the book in 1947, he can escape the charge that in 2021 these ideas are no longer applicable, because he grounds his argument in a particular historical context. So in that context, these issues were very vital. Okay. So if you do not read the next two chapters, it is all right for now, but of course read the first chapter, definitely. All right. So the discussion of realism in Sartre's book is very interesting, and as you see that this discussion is related to the discussion of freedom. So both of us bear the responsibility for the universe. Both of us, that is I, the reader, and the writer of this work, this novel. The writer discloses the world and I perceive the world of the novel. So both of us are responsible. What kind of world we disclose and perceive? Do we disclose and perceive an unjust world? Therefore we are responsible. Okay, so Sneha raised this question of responsibility. And precisely because this universe is supported by the joint effort of our two freedoms, and because the author, with me as medium, has attempted to integrate it into the human, it must appear truly in itself, in its very marrow, as being shot through and through with the freedom which has taken human freedom as its end. And if it is not really the city of ends that it ought to be, if it must at least be a stage along the way, in a word, it must be a becoming, and it must always be considered and presented not as a crushing mass which weighs us down, but from the point of view of its going beyond towards that city of ends. So here we see that Sartre is using the concept in itself, the world in itself. So if you remember, being in itself was the ideal condition where being is perceived in its totality. The entire world, the entire totality of the world is perceived in one's consciousness, that is being in itself. So the universe, or the universe can be represented as, to some extent, in itself. Means in its true self, in its real self, if it is shot and shot through, that is, if the idea of freedom pervades it. Why? Because the universe cannot come into place in the first place without the consciousness of the reader. You remember? Because the writer cannot look at the work as an object, so it is entirely dependent upon the reader's consciousness to come into existence. And since the reader is exercising his freedom, therefore the universe that is perceived in this book should be shot and shot through freedom. Which means that even if the writer had represented the world as a city with ends, that is an existence with some teleological goals, some selfish ends, an unjust world, Even if the writer had represented an unjust world, a city with ends, the reader must be able to transcend that city with ends. However bad and hopeless the humanity which it paints may be, the work must have an air of generosity. Sartre very cleverly avoids the word ethics and instead of that uses the word generosity. But what he means here is that actually the work should represent an ethical universe, and it should encourage the reader to participate in an ethical relationship to the universe. What does ethics mean? Once again, ethics means our attitude to others, our generosity to others. Alright. So when Sartre says generosity, you read ethics. Not of course that this generosity is to be expressed by means of edifying discourse and virtuous characters. It must not even be premeditated, and it is quite true that fine sentiments do not make fine books. So Sartre says that I am not saying that the novelist should write a preaching kind of book, a book where he preaches ethics, preaches ideal behavior, conduct and so on. No. That is why he said it must have an air of generosity. He did not say complete generosity. Right? So fine sentiment does not make fine books. That is, he is rejecting openly moral kind of writing. He says that I do not want writing to be overtly moral or moralistic. But it must be the very warp and woof of the book, the stuff out of which the people and things are cut. Whatever the subject, a sort of essential lightness must appear everywhere and remind us that the work is never a natural datum, but an exigence and a gift. Very clever, intelligent and significant statement that Sartre makes here, that the world that is presented through a novel, through a book, the reader must not forget that that is not the real world. That is constructed world, that is an imaginary world, and therefore it is not a natural datum, it is not a given fact. And then he uses two words, exigence and a gift. Now, you have already heard the word exigence a great number of times in this essay. Exigence means that it comes into place by chance. So as the reader reads a book by chance, similarly the writer also decides to write a book by chance. That is also an exigent phenomenon. And the second word, gift. It is a gift from the writer to the world, but the word gift also has ethical connotation. Gift suggests generosity. Generosity means ethics. It is you are generous to others. So, if it is a gift, then it should have the qualities of a gift. It should have an air of generosity. Well, I think I have consumed most of the time without letting you say much.